Pokemon is awesome, but it could have been so much better. No, I'm not talking about you, but about how in every generation there are a lot of beta elements that were planned for the games, but ended up never seeing the light of day. Many of these concepts are early ideas that would be improved in the final versions, or strange things that were wisely discarded. But a handful of these elements had the potential to make us fall even more in love with this universe. Today we'll look at the best scrapped beta element from each generation, analyzing what they could have meant if they had been included in the final versions, and trying to figure out why they never made it through the heart of the cartridges and their creation. Pokemon Red and Blue marked a turning point in history, but among all the beta secrets hidden in their chaotic creation, there's one mirage more intriguing than the rest: their lost protagonist. Many people believe that Leaf, as I like to call her to avoid confusion and the mess of names and translations, was born in Pokemon Leaf Green. But in reality, carried by the wind, she has always been there. From the very first preliminary drafts, the first doodles trying to define what this world was going to be, back when it was still called Capsule Monsters. In these famous old sketches, a young girl with a very similar appearance to Red appears repeatedly, and until recently, it was assumed she was just a generic design to illustrate the daily life of a trainer, nothing more significant. But with the successive leaks we've had over the years, one day, some never before seen mini sprites of a girl were revealed, alongside the beta sprites of Red, looking very similar to that mysterious figure. What if this trainer wasn't just another NPC, but was actually the one they originally had in mind to star in the Kanto adventure alongside Red? What if the option to choose your gender, which we didn't get until Pokemon Crystal, wasn't just planned for the first generation games, but was actually there from the very first fleeting ideas of Tajiri and the earliest sketches by Sugimori, back when Pokemon was just a dream and Game Freak was still in its infancy? But then, why did she disappear? Especially considering that there actually were moves in that direction, softening the look of the originally rough and aggressive Pokemon and adding species to the Pokédex that would resonate with different kinds of players. It's clear that from the very beginning, they really wanted to appeal to all types of audiences, which makes Leaf's disappearance even more mysterious and hard to understand. Was it simply a technical issue? We know that the development of the first games was a whirlwind of tight deadlines and many ideas scrapped due to hardware and programming limitations. It's possible that the young Game Freak team dove into programming the games like chickens with their heads cut off, leaving the inclusion of the female character for a later stage of development, only to realize too late that they had underestimated how complex it would be. What would that Pokemon world have been like with a female perspective from the very beginning? Fortunately, this girl would be reborn in the not-so-distant future as the enigmatic protagonist of the remake, but even that rebirth had its bittersweet undertones. As a silent avatar, her character was limited to a design, a sprite. But somehow these evoked an air of mystery, like the echo of a story that was never told. But it's in the surprising reincarnation of this character, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, where we finally got to see her in action. Kind but mischievous, affectionate yet clever, a figure full of contrasts that hints at the great story waiting to be told. The second generation marked the peak of the original Pokémania, and for good reason. As if trying to make up for their previous mistakes, it brought color to the Pokemon world, introducing most of the features of this universe that we know today. But the crown jewel awaited at the end of the journey: a final tour through Kanto, an ode to nostalgia that everyone from that generation has idealized. However, over time, it has come to light that behind that facade of love and memories, there were some serious challenges hidden away. The cartridge's space limitations made including that second region an odyssey, forcing them to restrict it quite a bit. But it seems that initially this was going to be even more extreme. In the Space World beta, we got to see an ultra-compressed, condensed version of Kanto that seemed like a joke. So much so that all the cities shared a single map barely larger than Goldenrod City. This was Pallet Town, this was Celadon City, and this was Saffron. It seems that at first, rather than a real journey to Kanto, they intended to include a sort of theme park that recreated the region in miniature, a stroll through some of its locations that vaguely reminded you of the adventure from 3 years ago, but that couldn't even come close to Red's adventure. That idea was eventually scrapped, thank Arceus, when the game's production was extended and development was moved to the new Game Boy Color. They managed, with the extra space provided by the new technology, to miraculously include a much more respectable Kanto, almost on par with the original, by pulling off some programming magic. But even so, given the circumstances, they had to leave out a lot of things that, judging by the remnants in the game's code, they clearly wanted to include, and that would have made that cartridge the ultimate Pokemon experience. For example, the legendary birds ultimately didn't appear and couldn't be obtained in any way other than by trading, yet they have a 50% escape rate assigned to them as wild Pokemon. This is quite intriguing, since the fact that they even went as far as to program this tells us they really had something planned for them, and that their encounter must have been removed in the final stages of development. It's also interesting that they share this chance to flee with their Johto counterparts, the legendary beasts, but only with a 50% chance instead of the 100% chance the beasts have. Add to that the fact that in the final beta of the game, a prototype much more advanced than the 97 beta, the Seafoam Islands actually had both of their entrances just like in the first generation before one of them was sealed off, suggesting that they were going to be explorable to hunt Articuno just like in the remakes. Now how does that fit with that mysterious programmed escape rate? Did they have in mind an encounter with each of the birds in their respective dungeons where you wouldn't battle them but instead wake them up, sending them off to roam all over Kanto so you could start hunting them as roaming Pokemon like what happened with Mesprit and Cresselia in the 4th generation? That would have been incredible, and I wonder where could Zapdos and Moltres have appeared then? The power plant doesn't really seem like an option now that it's up and running again. Unless you want to add a secret passage in the generator room, like they made me believe when I was a kid. Don't tell me this room wasn't super suspicious. But a more interesting possibility that I've always associated with Zapdos is Kanto's new radio tower, the region's old cemetery, which now, thanks to the radio waves, would gain a special kind of electromagnetism. And conveniently, a security guard blocks us from entering the door, adding to the mystery of whether something unusual is happening on the upper floors. As for Moltres, it really seemed like it was going to be connected to the volcanic eruption on Cinnabar Island, a place in Kanto that ultimately ended up very unfinished and with nothing interesting to do. It would have been too much to ask to find out what happened to all the residents. Seeing that the latest beta has maps of its laboratories, who knows if they just made up the whole eruption story to save space. Other closed-off places were also functional in that beta, like the Pewter City Museum or the Safari Zone, with its well-known beta map that can even be accessed in the final games using cheats. If that journey through Kanto is so idealized by the kids of that generation, can you imagine what it would have been like if they hadn't been so limited? Especially since, with the short lifespan of its internal battery, everything was destined to disappear and remain just an idealized memory. Heart Gold and Soul Silver gave them a chance to make up for a lot of that. Maybe a lot of the new features we saw in these games were already planned originally, and that's why these remakes feel so true to the original essence of Pokemon. Now, in the 3rd generation, history would repeat itself in a much harsher way. Because when it comes to the dream of a second region, it's one thing to be forced to restrict and limit it like we saw in Gold and Silver. another to compress it into a kind of model, as they intended to do in their betas, and quite another to remove it completely, forcing us to wake up from that dream all of a sudden. One thing is clear, one way or another, the idea of including Johto in the post-game of Ruby and Sapphire was on the table. We don't know if they were considering including the entire region, if it was just going to be a few cities, or even just a small nod to remember the previous journey. But the audio tracks from the region, Route 38, the Goldenrod City Communication Center, or the legendary Beasts battle theme make it clear that Johto was going to have something to say after defeating Steven. Add to that the traces of prominence that Johto Pokemon showed in the early days of the 3rd generation, like the 3 starters hidden in Pokemon Pinball, or the fact that the protagonist family comes from Olivine City, with certain NPCs in Ruby and Sapphire who talk to us about Johto, something they conveniently removed starting with Emerald and in the later remakes. Everything seems to point to a planned return to Johto at the end of the journey, disembarking in our hometown Olivine City on the SS Tidal and reuniting with the adventures hidden in that mysterious region. But something made them change course. And speaking of cartridges that on the Game Boy Advance already had much more power, far from previous limitations, the mystery of why all this was ultimately scrapped is still being debated. Maybe they scrapped the idea because the possibility of making remakes of the previous games came up, a way to bring back old regions and, of course, much more profitable for them. Also, with the GameCube on the horizon, the fact that Colosseum was the only place to get the lost Johto Pokemon for a significant period of time would definitely have sold a lot of consoles back then just for that reason. Maybe the logistical nightmare that was including Kanto in the 2nd generation also played a part, making them more cautious. Maybe it didn't turn out to be such a bad thing after all, because if Johto had been included in the post-game, perhaps the magnificent Battle Frontier would never have existed. Say whatever you want. But when I hear this version of the legendary Beasts theme played with 3rd generation instruments, I can't help but feel a bit bitter. At some point during the 4th generation, an idea was put on the table that, if implemented, could have changed the series forever. We've been traveling through different regions, challenging the gym leaders, but a dream that many of us have always had is to have our own gym. But it seems that dream almost became a reality in Diamond and Pearl. In the recent leaks, which, as you've probably noticed, I've approached with caution for obvious reasons, someone at Game Freak wrote these words after Emerald was released. I think it would be interesting if the protagonist could open a gym, other players online could challenge you. You could also invite other trainers to be your underlings. If the leader or the underlings win, the gym would earn money that could be used to expand the facility and get special decorations. But if you lose, the gym's popularity would drop and the trainers would leave you. Sounds like the best game mechanic ever, doesn't it? Now, here's the problem I was talking about with these leaks and why I've avoided discussing them so much. We have this loose text from some Game Freak computers, sure, but we don't know the exact position of the person who wrote it or the context in which they did so. Maybe it was just a random beta tester who started fantasizing without any real significance. Or maybe it really was someone with more influence in the company, but there's something that makes me think this idea really was seriously considered and that we might even see more of it in the future. The reason is that in Kalos and Alola, we would see leaks of very similar attempts, with the evolution of secret bases over time coming pretty close to what this lost text had imagined. In the case of the 7th generation, even image files were leaked, once again testing out that mechanic of opening your own gym. It seems like Game Freak has had this idea in their sights since Diamond and Pearl, bringing it back in every generation, which gives me reason to believe that maybe this won't be the last time we hear about it. The fifth generation marked the end of the pixel art era and the prelude to 3D. It was a true celebration of the artistic style where they definitely pushed the limits of the technology, maybe more than any other game in the series has managed to do. A decision that has aged like fine wine, but at the time it drew quite a bit of criticism. Back then, the public was becoming more and more obsessed with 3D, and Game Freak was well aware of it, because it seems that by the time of Black and White, they already intended to take that hybrid of 2D and 3D elements and camera movements much further. The Sky Arrow Bridge was one of the first areas designed with that system in mind, featuring a fully controllable 3D camera. Unlike the final version, which used fixed angles to create a cinematic feel, the beta allowed you to move the camera freely with intuitive controls using the touchscreen. Another test phase brought this system to a traditional town similar to Violet City, showing that even classic settings could benefit from this aesthetic. The experiment worked surprisingly well, with precise controls and immersive graphics. But Game Freak's ambitions didn't stop there. They also tested a rotating camera in battles, allowing the player to change the perspective right in the middle of a fight. It's not known whether this feature was meant to be part of the final game or if it was just a test for dynamic visual effects, but it shows how far Game Freak was willing to push the Nintendo DS hardware and the beautiful 2.5D style that many believe should have remained in the series. One way or another, we arrived at the 3D era with X and Y. Kalos is all the rage. The surprising announcement of Legends AZ has brought the region of art back into the spotlight with a facelift that makes the days of X and Y feel like a distant memory. But many of you who lived through those days will remember how intensely the old Pokemon community experienced it. I've almost always been lucky enough to have people around me, even if it was just a few trusted friends with whom I could share this passion for Pokemon. But the twilight of the 5th generation, the final days of the Nintendo DS, was when I felt the most alone. I was barely able to make up for that loneliness with the occasional game with old friends, and it was also around that time that I discovered Pokemon Showdown. But then the first trailer for X and Y came out, showing off that new 3D Pokemon world, and everyone experienced it with excitement, eager to come back, even those who had already drifted away from the series. And it wasn't an isolated thing. A lot of people returned to Pokemon thanks to Kalos and the 3DS, and the Pokemon community flourished. Kalos tells us about the power of encounters, and wow, that was a powerful reunion. With that rebirth, that new Poke boom, the theories, rumors, and speculations came back too. And if there was one theory that really carried weight during this period, it was the hypothetical existence of a new area in the region, South Kalos, which was referenced many times in the game. References that got all of us excited back then, but in the end, we never heard about it again. But what if I told you that there were actually very serious plans to include it? Very advanced details about its creation, which we've been able to learn more about thanks to leaks, with this map. Finding it makes me both happy and sad at the same time, seeing all those lost locations that could have held so many stories. As for Alola, in other regions, tons of species, storylines, graphic elements, or, more painfully, important parts of the map, like in X and Y, were left out. In Alola, however, because of the series' 20th anniversary, most of those elements saw the light of day, and where the most content was left out was actually in the mechanics. For example, an evolution of the contest that never saw the light of day, and a Pokédoll system. These are really interesting mechanics, but among them, there's one that might seem minor, but is extremely intriguing, and I would have loved to see it in the games: the Pokemon manga. In the words of Satoshi Tajiri, the father of the franchise, it's the work that has come closest to the original idea of the Pokemon world he had in mind. Alola, like every region, had its own manga, but in this region, there's an unpublished manga or comic that never saw the light of day within the game itself. It was going to be a mechanic where the events of the story would be collected in comic strip form, which we could read in our trainer profile as we progress through the plot and unlock new entries. Obviously, I don't think it would have been as elaborate as a real manga. It probably would have just been a few panels as a fun summary of the story, but I still think think it's a really original touch that I'd love to see them bring back someday. Maybe they could even use it to expand the story and take the opportunity to show some details that aren't fully resolved in the game's dialogue. It'd be a good way to add a bit more depth to the plot in an optional way without boring the player. As for Sword and Shield, it's probably the least interesting installment when it comes to removed elements, mostly just featuring beta maps, so I'm going to talk about the 3 most important elements that were removed from the games, and let me know if any of them stand out to you. The free camera movement, which ultimately was limited to just the wild area, was originally going to be available throughout the entire region. An item called Autograph is found in the game's beta files, but it wasn't used. This is a signature from the Pokemusicians band, Rillaboom, Obstagoon, and Toxtricity, who appear in the game's credits, so it seems like they had planned some kind of side quest to get their autographs. Finally, maybe the juiciest beta element from these games is their beta battles, featuring key story characters that you ultimately couldn't face. Battles against Sonia, Professor Magnolia, an extra battle with Chairman Rose, and even against your own mother! To wrap up, the 9th generation marked a new leap in the richness and biodiversity of the Pokédex. This is done through new concepts and ideas such as paradoxes and those that concern us now, convergent forms. An evolution of the idea of regional forms, or rather the opposite phenomenon. If regional forms are the same species adapting to the conditions of a different environment, the so-called convergent Pokémon are entirely new species that nevertheless developed and evolved in a way very similar to Pokémon we already know after being exposed to similar evolutionary pressures, but in a different ecosystem. I truly hope this mechanic is here to stay and that we see more of it in future regions, especially since it was pretty underused with only 2 lines, one of which is particularly questionable in terms of logic. But it seems there were actually plans for another one, a particularly iconic species that I think would have been epic to see this idea applied to. During the analysis of the internal code of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, it was discovered that the file names corresponding to Toedscool and Toedscruel are actually the Japanese names for Magikarp and Gyarados, which suggests that originally these Pokemon were going to have convergent forms instead of Tentacool and Tentacruel. Although there are no official designs, the fact that their names remained unchanged in the code shows that this must have been scrapped in the final stages of development. The reason for this change is a complete mystery, and unfortunately, there isn't any concept art or scrap design to give us an idea of what direction they were going to take. Maybe it was going to be a land-based line with a pathetically weak Pokemon, but with great jumping ability, and just like how it's said that Magikarp who's climbed the waterfall are rewarded with evolution, it would evolve into an unbeatable monster after climbing one of Paldea's high peaks? What kind of convergence can you imagine for such an iconic species?